EDU5TEA Assessment 2 Professional Experience Reflection Part A, Indigenous Education Presentation. So, Indigenous Education. An overview of my teaching method areas and things like that. So, the method area is outdoor and environmental studies. I'm aiming this work at Year 12, which would be part of the VCE Unit 3. And we're going to look at the outcome relationships with outdoor environments. For the success learning criteria, we're going to use a SAC, and the resources required are field trip, ICT, audio visual, and the field trips with outdoor education often include Indigenous components to it, so we'll get into that a little bit later. In terms of the curriculum, so using the VCE outcomes, which are specifically relationships with the outdoors and sustainability with outdoor relationships. So relationships in the outdoors covers basically Australia as a whole from pre-European occupation right up until now, and it does a great job of focusing on the work of Indigenous occupants and the way that they related to the land and the way that Europeans have interacted with it since and the consequences that has had. In terms of the fieldwork I was talking about, Indigenous education companies operate through many of the national parks and other basically environments that we act with in outdoor education. So the use of those companies is often undertaken when doing field work, especially when looking at relationships with outdoors. And I think it's important to integrate the Indigenous education components into the curriculum rather than pulling them apart and talking about them separately. So as we talk about things, just discuss it as a part of our history, which it is, instead of pulling it aside and saying, you know, let's look at Indigenous culture. In terms of classroom support, so one of my resources, 8 Ways, talks about Indigenous pedagogy and ways of engaging and helping Indigenous students learn. So the engagement strategies will focus on verbal instruction because often Indigenous students don't have as high a literacy because of their upbringing and their culture. They do a lot of talking, a lot of oral work, and a lot of information is passed down verbally. The use of ICT and audio-visual resources, so again engaging their senses that aren't reading and writing. Making sure there's clear and concise instruction, so with all the tasks in the SAC, you know, breaking it down for them instead of having it broken down themselves. The links to the land, making sure that we understand that Indigenous occupation and how it links back to what we're studying and links into the land. And again, that everything's integrated. So instead of putting Indigenous occupation and Indigenous history and Indigenous education aside, it's just part of the whole curriculum and it's part of the way the classroom's built in so that Indigenous students don't feel and Indigenous education doesn't feel like it's separate from everything else. NAIDOC Week is important to provide cultural awareness, inclusivity and confidence to all the students and particularly those ones from Indigenous backgrounds. So an activity that I would promote in NAIDOC Week, which occurs in July every year. So in terms of the VCE outcomes, we'd still be looking at relationships with the outdoors, or you might have possibly moved into Unit 4, which focuses on sustainability and outdoor relationships. So some sort of an Indigenous assessment activity, and looking at doing a Canva or a brochure. So Canva is a program used to make visual projects, so posters, social marketing campaigns, things like that, or a brochure or a handout or something like that. So focusing on the strengths of Indigenous people, the audio-visual side of everything, The assignment will include roles of Indigenous people in conservation and roles of Indigenous people in, DEPI, Parks Victoria, tourism, making sure that we understand the role that Indigenous people have and the influences that they're having on us being sustainable in our relationships. And then just to solidify the information, doing a Kahoot or a Socrative quiz on Indigenous components within the aforementioned topics, so DEPI, parks, conservation, sustainability, all those things. My justification for that is it explores Indigenous roles that they have within the government and that they have within our more solidified concept of outdoors within Victoria. It'll highlight the importance of the culture that Indigenous people bring to the outdoors, their relationships with the land, which is vastly different from the way we interact with it as Europeans, and environmental sustainability, which again is vastly different from the way in which Europeans view environmental sustainability. Dare to Lead is one of the resources that I've become quite fond of, and it's a Commonwealth funded initiative, and they've got a whole website at daretolead.edu.au, which includes a great number of things, teaching resources for teachers, professional development and professional redevelopment and going through things like that, research and readings from those research, so specific articles about things that are happening, what's working well, what's not working well, what we can change. And they've got a whole series of videos on Indigenous education, and they have a whole lot of school initiatives and examples of how different schools are promoting Indigenous education. And my final resource is 8 Ways, so 8ways.wikispaces.com, and it's a great website with a whole host of content information that's really exhaustive but absolutely fantastic. It's based around the New South Wales curriculum and education side, but there's no reason it can't be used in other states as well. So it has examples of Indigenous pedagogy and the 8 ways of Indigenous learning, which I spoke about before. So it's recognised that Indigenous peoples don't necessarily learn the same way that Europeans do. So it's important to understand their culture and the way that they do things and use that in the classroom as a strength and know what it is and how to engage with those students rather than trying to force upon them the ways that we currently school. It has real world examples of what schools that they're working with are doing and how they're achieving it. Again, what's successful and what's not, similar to Dare to Lead, and how we can utilise those things. It has teacher support as well. So on the Wikispaces website, you can leave comments and people respond to those comments, both people that are working for 8 Ways and people that are using 8 Ways as well. Huge amount of teacher support. They run professional development through the 8 Ways of learning, teaching how to use them, how to integrate them, how to make them part of the curriculum, and also how you can use the 8 Ways to engage not only Indigenous students but non-Indigenous students as well, which is fantastic because then it is more a part and more of a process of your curriculum and your pedagogy as a whole, rather than signalling it out. So that's my presentation for EDU5TEA Assessment 2 Professional Experience Reflection Part A Indigenous Education presentation. Thank you. A full list of resources will be uploaded with my presentation with the hyperlink to this video, and they can be found underneath the hyperlink on the next page.